One of the main problems we see is lack of abdominal control in a lot of people. Why do people have a lack of abdominal control? Or when people come up to do a sit-up and they're coming down, they see a lot of ratcheting. Part of the reason of that is because of the neurological connection. When we look at the amount, the area of the brain, the real estate literally in our frontal lobe, the area that produces movement, that's going to affect the abdomen, it's a very small part affecting an extremely large muscle in this area with a large cross-sectional area. Let's take, for example, our hand. Areas of our body, like our hands or our faces or our lips, have high areas of representation in our cortex. In other words, we're able to sense, feel, move things in a very smooth and articulate manner because we've got a large portion of our brain dedicated to that part. Unfortunately for us, with our abdomens, our core, which is extremely important for ambulation, movement, exercise, basically anchoring us to the ground, we have a very small portion of our brain which is actually dedicated to that. So we have small portion driving a large muscle which has multiple levels of innervation and 4 different layers that we're dealing with. In this DVD today, we're going to teach you how to make this cortical connection better, the connection between the brain and the abdomen, and how more effectively we can make these 4 layers of the abdomen work synergistically. So one of the problems with a traditional crunch or a sit-up is going to be that it's not effectively working the deeper layers of the abdomen, which wrap around and actually attach to the spine. Just to review from before, we have 4 layers of the abdomen. The rectus abdominis, which is on top, goes from the lower border of the ribs to the pubic tubercles. Okay? Its main job is flexion of the lumbar spine. We're going to have the external obliques, which are going to run in this direction, anchoring the lower portions of the rib cage to the pelvis. The internal obliques run on a 90-degree angle to that. They're going to have a similar function as well, and again, these things need to function synergistically. They come down, as Dr. Allen was talking about earlier, in a V fashion in the bottom. And then we have the transversus abdominis. It's the transversus abdominis and the internal obliques that wrap around and actually attach to the thoracolumbar fascia, which is help us to create a rigid cylinder for us to superimpose movements of our torso on top of. So let's look at a typical crunch and point out some of the problems with that. So we can see as he's coming up here a couple things right off the bat. Number one, where we have a lot of flattening of the lumbar lordosis in this area here. If we teach the body to actually flatten and put the lumbar spine in this position as we're going through, we're actually going to compromise. We'll have you stop for just a second. We're actually going to compromise some of the mechanics not only of the lumbar spine but also of the glute and lower back. Our glute, the primary extensor of our hip, not the hamstring as a lot of times it's thought, okay, is going to be dependent upon us being able to have a stiff area for that to attach to. If I decrease my lumbar lordosis physiologically and now I try to contract that glute, I'm not going to be able to contract it nearly as efficiently as I can. Remember, we talked earlier about training being specific as to the type of contraction and the speed of contraction with which we're going to use it. So, a flattened lumbar lordosis while we're doing this may generate slightly more force when we look at EMG studies in this area, but it induces a non-physiological pattern of movement into the lumbar spine, which isn't something that we necessarily want to do. Can we have you do a couple more? The other thing we see a lot of times with the traditional crunch is that we just get a lot of facilitation of the rectus abdominis muscle in the front. Again, that's not necessarily providing lumbar stability. If we come into the side here and I poke as he's coming up, you can see he's not adequately firing his external oblique, or his internal oblique, we'll have you stop for a second, which is one of the stabilizers of the pelvis. So it's a great rectus abdominis exercise. Okay, makes you look really good on the beach and things like that, but it's really not going to give the athlete a whole lot of what he needs. Another thing that we notice as he's doing his traditional sit-up here, or a crunch, is that the legs are in somewhat of an abducted position. In other words, they're somewhat more out. This has a tendency to bring in the lower ab a lot more, and if we have a tendency to bring in the lower ab more, but those muscles aren't contracting appropriately, we're really not making a very effective exercise. Sean?
A comment on the chin poking.
Okay, let's have him go just a couple more. The other thing we notice is that he has a tendency to extend his head and bring his head forward. And I don't know if you can see from that angle, but we'll catch it on one of the other camera angles, but these muscles in the front of the neck here are having a tendency to poke out and push forward. This is accomplishing a few things that aren't so good. For one, we're putting a lot of tension in the anterior line of musculature on the forward part of the abdomen, putting this in a relatively compressed position. While that provides a good muscle contraction for the time being, that's not what we want to do in a competition. When we fire our flexor muscles on one side, we're going to inhibit our extensor muscles on the opposite side. That's the principle of reciprocal inhibition, which we had talked about at another portion of this DVD. If I'm turning on these muscles here, I'm going to have a tendency to turn off the muscles on the back part of his neck. If I turn off the muscles on the back part of his neck, I'm going to inhibit the entire extensor mechanism of the spine. And remember, a lot of our power and force are going to be generated through our extensors, not our flexors. It's a neurological reflex. So we don't want to be chin poking. We don't also want to be over-recruiting these neck flexors, in this case, his sternocleidomastoid.